The envelope was already on the kitchen counter when I walked in. She didn't hand it to me. She just pointed. I set down my keys. I set down my jacket. I looked at her face before I looked at the envelope, because I always believed you could learn more from a person's eyes than from anything they'd written. Her eyes told me she had already decided. The envelope was just the formality. I was 63 years old that afternoon. I had been married to my wife for 22 years. I had built 2 businesses, sold one, and kept the other running for 11 years without a single missed payroll. I had refinished the floors in our house with my own hands. I had driven her mother to chemotherapy every Thursday for 14 months, when her mother was sick and my wife couldn't bring herself to watch. I had done all of this without asking to be thanked, because that is not why I did it. I picked up the envelope. Inside was a letter from an attorney. The letter informed me that my wife had, 3 days prior, received a wire transfer of $1.4 million following the settlement of her father's estate. The letter further informed me that my wife was initiating a formal separation and requesting that I vacate our shared home within 30 days. I read it twice, not because I hadn't understood it the first time. I read it twice because I was deciding how to respond, and I have always believed that the space between stimulus and response is where a man's character lives. I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I set the envelope on the counter. I said, "Did you have your attorney draft this, or did you draft it yourself?" She said, "Does it matter?" I said, "It matters to me." She looked away. She said the attorney had drafted it. She said she had been thinking about this for a long time. She said the money changed things. She said she finally had options she didn't have before. I asked what options she meant. She said she meant all of them. I nodded. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed in the room where I had slept for 22 years, and I looked at my hands for a while. They were older hands than the hands that had carried her bags into this house. The knuckles were bigger. There were 2 scars I hadn't had when we met. I looked at those scars and I thought about everything they represented. All the work, all the years, all the mornings I had gotten up before she was awake to make sure things were handled before the day began. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, not because I think there is anything wrong with crying, but because what I felt in that moment was not grief. It was something older and quieter than grief. It was recognition. I had been paying attention to my wife for 22 years, and somewhere in the last 4 or 5 of those years, something in her had shifted. I had noticed. I had tried to ask about it. She had told me I was imagining things. I was not imagining things. I went back downstairs. She was standing at the window with a glass of wine. She did not turn around when I came in. I said, "I'm not going to fight you on this." She turned around then. I think she expected something else. I said, "But before either of us does anything else, I'd like to sit down with my own attorney and make sure we're both clear on what this process actually involves." She said that was fine. She said her attorney had already outlined everything. She said I would receive my fair share. I said, "I'm sure I will." I called my attorney the next morning. His name was Douglas, and I had known him for 18 years, since before I sold my first company. He was not the kind of attorney who performed. He was the kind of attorney who prepared. There is a significant difference. I met him at his office on a Tuesday. His office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that had no signage on the exterior, which I had always appreciated. He poured me coffee without asking. He sat down across from me and he said, "Tell me what happened." I told him. I told him about the inheritance, about the letter, about the 30-day request to vacate. I told him what she had said at the window with her glass of wine. Douglas listened. He wrote 3 things on a notepad. Then he set his pen down and said, "Do you remember the trust?" I said I remembered the trust. He said, "Then you already know that the 30 days is not something she can enforce." I want to explain the trust because it is the part of this story that I think matters most, and I want to explain it correctly. 11 years ago, when my son was 21 and had just graduated from college, I sat down with Douglas and I restructured how I held my assets. My business at the time was generating enough revenue that certain protections made sense. But the reason I restructured was not the business. The reason was something my own father had told me when I was young. He had said that a man who builds things and does not protect what he builds is not building for himself. He is building for whoever happens to be standing nearby when the walls come down. My father had watched his own father lose a farm that way. He had watched it happen and he never forgot it. So 11 years ago, Douglas and I created a revocable living trust. I transferred the house into it. I transferred my stake in the business into it. The trust named me as the primary trustee and my son as the successor trustee. My wife had been named as a beneficiary of the trust for as long as we were legally married, which meant she had access to the benefits of the assets, but she did not own them in a way that gave her unilateral authority over them. This is not a loophole. It is not a trick. It is a legal instrument that my attorney prepared, that I signed in front of witnesses, that was properly recorded. My wife had been informed of the trust when it was created. I had sat down with her and Douglas both and explained it. She had nodded and said it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. What she had not done, apparently, was remember it. Or perhaps she had remembered it and hoped I had not. Douglas explained to her attorney, in writing, within 4 days of my visit, that the house was held in a trust, that I was the trustee, and that any attempt to compel me to vacate would need to go through the proper legal channels, which would involve demonstrating cause. There was no cause. There had been no abuse, no infidelity, no misconduct of any kind. There was only a wife who had received money and decided she wanted a different life. The response from her attorney took 9 days. Those 9 days were interesting. I continued to live in the house. I cooked dinner. I watched the news in the evenings. I maintained my routines, because routines are what keep a man steady when the ground under him is moving. My wife and I occupied the same space without occupying the same life. She spent a great deal of time on her phone. She had lunch out several days in a row. She came home smelling like a restaurant I didn't recognize. I did not ask about it. I was not performing indifference. I was genuinely focused on what mattered, which was the process, not the performance. On the 10th day, her attorney's response arrived. It said that my wife accepted that the house was held in trust, but contended that the trust itself should be considered a marital asset subject to division, and that her share of that asset, combined with her inheritance, entitled her to request a buyout of my interest. I read that letter at the kitchen table. I read it carefully. Then I called Douglas. Douglas said, "She can make that argument. It has some merit." I said, "What does that mean for the business?" He said, "That's the part we need to discuss. Here is what I need to tell you about the business, because it is not a simple thing to explain, but it is important that I try. When I sold my first company, I had been 48 years old and tired in a specific way that only founders understand. Not tired of working. Tired of working on something I no longer believed in. I sold it and I rested for 8 months, and then I started the second one, which was a property management company, smaller than the first, built to last rather than built to sell. Over the 11 years I had been running it, I had brought my son in as a minority partner. I had done this deliberately and openly, because I wanted him to have a stake in something real, something that would be there for him after I was gone. I had transferred 15% of my stake to him when he turned 28. I had documented every aspect of this transfer. Douglas had handled all of it. The result was that by the time my wife received her inheritance and sent me that letter, I held 51% of the company, my son held 15%, and a silent partner I had brought in 7 years ago held the remaining 34%. My wife held 0%. She had never asked to be involved. She had attended the company Christmas party twice in 11 years and had not seemed to enjoy either occasion. Her attorney's argument about the trust, potentially including the business, was the argument I had expected. It was a reasonable opening position. It was not, however, a strong one, because of one document that Douglas had prepared years earlier, a spousal acknowledgement. When I restructured everything into the trust 11 years ago, my wife had signed a document acknowledging that she understood the structure of the trust, understood what it held, and understood that her interest in it was as a beneficiary rather than a co-owner. The document was notarized. The document was filed. Douglas sent a copy of that document to her attorney with a brief cover letter that did not editorialize. It simply attached the document and noted the date and the notarization. Her attorney went quiet for 6 days. During those 6 days, something happened that I had not anticipated. My son called me. He called on a Wednesday evening, around 7:30, while I was reading on the back porch. I had been reading a book about the Lewis and Clark expedition, which I mention not because it is relevant, but because I remember exactly where I was in it when the phone rang. And I remember thinking that the men in that book had navigated things far harder than what I was navigating, which helped me answer calmly. My son said, "Dad," she called me. I said, "Your mother called you?" He said yes. He said she had called him the day before and told him that she was worried about the business. She had told him that I was being unreasonable and that my stubbornness might jeopardize the company for everyone involved. She had suggested that he might want to consider his own position carefully. I was quiet for a moment. My son said, I told her I needed time to think about it. I said, that was reasonable. He said, I've thought about it. I said, and? He said, I thought you should know, she called. That was all he said about it. He asked how I was doing. We talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with any of this. When we hung up, I sat on the porch until it got dark, and then I went inside and I called Douglas. I told Douglas about the call. Douglas said, that changes my recommendation. I said, I'm listening. He said that what my wife had done by contacting my son, who was a minority partner in the business, and suggesting that his position might be affected by the divorce proceedings, was an attempt to influence the business dispute outside of the legal process. He said it was not illegal, but it was the kind of thing that a judge tends to notice when it is documented. He said, I'd like to send her attorney a letter. I said, keep it factual. He said, that's the only kind I write. The letter went out the next morning. It documented the call, the date, the content as reported to me by my son, and noted that any further contact with business partners or other parties related to the ongoing proceedings should go through counsel. Her attorney called Douglas that same afternoon. I was not in that call. Douglas told me about it later. He said her attorney had been, in his words, somewhat less composed than he had been in previous communications. He said there had been a recalibration of expectations. I did not feel satisfaction about this. I want to be honest about that. I did not feel satisfaction because none of this was satisfying. It was simply necessary. There is a difference between winning and being protected. I was not trying to win anything. I was trying to make sure that what I had built over a lifetime was not dismantled in 30 days because someone had received a wire transfer and decided it changed the arithmetic of our marriage. The formal mediation was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In those 3 weeks, I continued to live my life as I had been living it. I drove to the office on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I had breakfast with my son on 2 Saturdays. I called my brother in Ohio, which I had been meaning to do for months and kept not doing. I started a new book. My wife moved through the house like she was already somewhere else. She was planning. I could see that. She was on her phone a great deal. She rearranged the furniture in the living room one afternoon, which I thought was an interesting choice given the circumstances, but I didn't say anything about it. 2 days before the mediation, she asked if we could talk. We sat at the kitchen table. She had made tea, which she handed to me without asking if I wanted it, the way she had always done. Old habits. I noticed it and didn't mention it. She said she wanted to know if there was any version of this where we didn't have to go through a full proceeding. I said, there was always that version, there still is. She said the money had changed how she saw things. She said for the first time in her life she had real security and she didn't want to share it. She said she knew how that sounded, but she was tired of pretending otherwise. I said, I understand. She said, do you? I said, you feel like you finally have something that's entirely yours, and having it made you realize how much you didn't feel like things were yours before. She was quiet. I said, I'm not angry about that, but I need you to understand that the things I have are also mine. The house, the business, what I've built. Those are mine the same way your inheritance is yours. She said she knew that. I said, then let's make sure whatever we agree to reflects that. The mediation lasted 4 hours. Her attorney came in with a prepared position that included a request for 40% of the business valuation, a buyout of my interest in the house, and a lump sum spousal support figure that I will not repeat here because it was, in the words of my attorney when he reviewed it beforehand, aspirational. Douglas responded with documentation. That is the most accurate way I know how to describe what happened over the next 3.5 hours. He responded with documentation, the spousal acknowledgement, the trust records, the business structure, including my son's minority stake and the silent partner agreement, both of which predated the proceedings and had been established for legitimate business reasons. The timeline of the trust's creation, the notarized signatures. Her attorney made arguments. Douglas responded to each argument with a document. My wife sat across the table from me for 4 hours. I watched her face change as the session went on. Not with drama, the way a face changes when it is recalibrating. When the picture it had formed of a situation turns out to be different from the actual terrain. At the 2-hour mark, her attorney asked for a recess. During the recess, I got coffee from the machine in the hallway. Douglas stood next to me. He said, "They're going to come back with a different number." I said, "What number?" He said, "Something reasonable." I said, "Define reasonable." He said, "Something that reflects what she's actually entitled to, which is a fair division of the assets we've established are marital." I said, "And the business?" He said, "They know they can't touch the structure. They'll ask for a cash equivalent of a small percentage and call it a settlement." I said, "And the house?" He said, "She can have the equity she's entitled to as a marital asset. That's fair. You'll refinance or sell and split accordingly." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the floors I had refinished. I thought about the morning I had carried her mother up those stairs during the last month of her illness because her mother's legs had stopped working reliably and my wife had not been strong enough to do it alone. I thought about 22 years of small decisions that had accumulated into something I had believed was permanent. I said, "That's fair." He said, "I know it doesn't feel that way." I said, "It feels exactly the way it is." They came back with different numbers. Closer to what Douglas had predicted, her attorney presented them without the earlier confidence. My wife looked at the table while he spoke. We settled that afternoon. She received her fair share of the marital assets, which were real and significant. She did not receive any portion of the business. She did not receive the house as a whole. We agreed to list it and divide the equity. The spousal support figure was a fraction of the original request and had a defined endpoint. Her attorney shook Douglas's hand at the end. He did not say much. Douglas did not say much either. My wife and I walked out of that building at different times. I came out first. I stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes and watched the street. It was an ordinary afternoon. People walked past with coffee cups and grocery bags. A man in a hard hat was eating a sandwich on the steps of the building, across the way. The city was doing what cities do, which is continue without regard for what has just happened to any particular person inside any particular room. I was not happy. I was also not destroyed. I was something more like clear. 22 years of a life I had believed in, concluded on a Tuesday afternoon with a signature and a handshake and a walk out into a city that did not notice. I drove to my son's office. I had not told him I was coming, but he was there and his assistant waved me through. He was on a call when I walked in. He held up one finger. I sat down in the chair across from his desk and waited. He finished the call. He looked at me. I said, "It's done." He said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Like a man who planned ahead." He laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one. I was glad to hear it. We sat there for a while and talked about the business, about the quarter coming up, about a property in the western part of the state that we'd been watching for 2 years and that had finally come available. We talked about the things that continue, the things that were there before the marriage and would be there after it, the things I had built and protected and passed forward. Before I left, my son said, "You know what I kept thinking about? When you sat me down and explained the trust, I was 21. I thought you were being paranoid." I said, "I wasn't being paranoid." He said, "I know. I understand that now." I said, "Your grandfather told me something once. He said a man who builds without protecting what he builds is just doing somebody else's work for them." My son wrote that down. I don't know why, exactly, but I watched him do it, and I was glad. I listed the house 6 weeks later. It sold in 11 days, which surprised me a little. A young couple bought it. The wife was pregnant, visibly, and she walked through every room with her hand on the wall as though she were measuring the space for something. I watched her do it from the front yard, and I thought about my wife walking through that house the first time, 23 years ago, before we had made any decisions about it. She had touched the door frames too. I had forgotten that until I watched this stranger do it. The equity was divided as agreed. I moved into an apartment on the east side of the city. It was the 4th floor of a building that was older than I was, with windows that let in a particular quality of morning light that I had not expected to love as much as I do. I brought what mattered. I left what didn't. It is a discipline, deciding what matters, and I was grateful to be forced into practicing it. I had breakfast with my son every other Saturday. I finished the book about Lewis and Clark and started one about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. I called my brother more often than I had in years. I got back to a habit I had abandoned a long time ago, which was walking in the evenings, just walking. No destination, Just the city and my own 2 feet and whatever I happened to think about along the way. 3 months after the settlement, I ran into her at a grocery store. It was a Sunday morning. She was in the produce section. We were both reaching for the same variety of apple, which I will admit struck me as funny, though I didn't say so. She looked at me. I looked at her. She looked older, and I suppose I did too. She said, "How are you?" I said, "Good, getting there." "You?" She said she was fine. She said the inheritance was in a managed account, and her advisor was conservative, but she felt secure. I said I was glad to hear it. She said, "I didn't think it would feel the way it does." I asked what she meant. She said, "I thought the money would be the thing that made everything else make sense. And it is mine. I know it's mine, but it's just money." I looked at her for a moment. I thought about saying something that would land with weight, something she'd remember. I thought about the floors. I thought about her mother. I thought about 22 years of Thursday mornings and refinished wood and a young couple with their hands on the walls. I said, "Take care of yourself." She said she would. I put the apples in my basket and walked to the next aisle. I did not look back. Not because I was performing anything, not because I wanted her to see me not looking back. I did not look back because there was nothing back there that I needed. Everything I had built was still standing. The business was still running. My son was still my son. The apartment had good morning light, and I still had my hands. Older now, scarred in 2 places I had already accounted for, but mine, still entirely mine. That is how it ended. Not with a confrontation. Not with a moment where I said something that cut through everything and finally made her understand. It ended in a grocery store on a Sunday morning with 2 people reaching for apples and then going their separate ways into the rest of their lives. I have thought about whether it should have ended differently. I have thought about it the way you think about a calculation you've run several times and keep getting the same answer. And the answer I keep getting is this: I am not in the business of dramatic endings. I am in the business of building things that last. That is what I did. That is what I have always done. That is what I will keep doing.